What if I told you the government has a detailed plan to legally steal 40% of your wealth, that there is a historical precedent, a proven playbook for confiscation that is being dusted off and prepared for deployment right now, in the 21st century? It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it is a documented fact of American history. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. The order made it a federal crime for American citizens to own gold. You were given just 30 days to walk into a bank and turn in your gold coins, your gold bars, every ounce you had saved to protect your family. If you refused, you faced a $10,000 fine, a crippling sum in the depths of the Great Depression, and up to 10 years in federal prison, 10 years behind bars, for simply owning a piece of metal. Most Americans, trusting their leaders and believing it was their patriotic duty, complied. They handed over their life savings in exchange for $20.67 per ounce, the official price that had been fixed for decades, they were told. This was a temporary measure, a necessary sacrifice to save the nation from economic collapse. They were lied to. Just 9 months later, after the vaults of the Federal Reserve were filled with the people's gold, Roosevelt unilaterally revalued it. The new official price was $35 per ounce, a staggering 69% increase overnight. In that single moment, the government had legally stolen 40% of the wealth from every citizen who had trusted them, and there was nothing anyone could do because owning gold was now a crime. This is not some forgotten chapter from a dusty textbook. This is the blueprint for financial survival, the government's emergency plan, and all the evidence suggests they are preparing to run the exact same play again. Right now, in the year 2025, the language is different. The assets have changed, but the mechanism of theft is identical, and this time they have technology on their side that Roosevelt could only have dreamed of. In this deep dive, I am going to expose precisely how this grand deception worked in 1933, why the current economic conditions make its return not just possible but inevitable, what the government is doing behind the scenes this very moment to position for a modern confiscation, and most importantly, what you must understand and do before it is too late. Because once this plan is executed, there are no second chances. You will either be on the right side of the greatest wealth transfer in history, or you will lose everything. First, let's dissect exactly what happened in 1933, because the details are chilling, and they revealed a pattern that is re-emerging today. America was on its knees, trapped in the suffocating grip of the Great Depression. The unemployment rate was a catastrophic 25%. 1 in 4 able-bodied workers had no job. Banks were failing by the thousands, taking the savings of ordinary families with them. The debt-to-GDP ratio was 40% and climbing relentlessly. Now, that might not sound extreme compared to today's gargantuan 132%, but there was a critical difference. In 1933, the US dollar was backed by physical gold. Every paper dollar in circulation was a promise, a claim check, redeemable for a specific amount of gold at the fixed rate of $20.67 per ounce. This gold standard created an enormous problem for the government. As the Depression worsened, people's faith in the banking system evaporated. They rushed to withdraw their deposits, and they didn't want paper currency. They no longer trusted. They demanded gold. This created a massive run on the nation's gold reserves. The Federal Reserve was bleeding gold at an alarming rate. Under the rules of the gold standard, they couldn't simply print more money to stimulate the economy because they needed more gold to back it. The money supply was shrinking, which led to a devastating deflationary spiral. Prices were falling, wages were collapsing, and debts became impossible to pay because each dollar owed was becoming more valuable and harder to earn. The system was breaking. Roosevelt knew he had to shatter the link between the dollar and gold. He needed the freedom to print money without restraint. But he couldn't just announce the end of the gold standard. That would have triggered total panic and a complete collapse of confidence. So he devised a far more cunning plan. First, confiscate the gold. Executive Order 6102 was the weapon. It commanded all persons to deliver all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank on or before May 1st, 1933. There were a few minor exceptions. You could keep up to 5 ounces of gold for personal use, roughly $100 worth. Jewelers and dentists could keep what they needed for their trade. But for ordinary Americans holding gold as a form of savings, as a shield against uncertainty, it was now contraband. The penalties for disobedience were designed to ensure compliance. A fine of up to $10,000, which in today's money is the equivalent of about $230,000, and a threat of up to 10 years in a federal prison. The message was clear. We are not asking. The government wanted the gold, and they got it. Most citizens complied, not just out of fear, but out of a sense of civic duty. They believed they were helping to stabilize the fractured banking system. They could never have imagined what was coming next. The government waited patiently. After the May 1st deadline passed and the vast majority of the nation's private gold was securely in their vaults, they let 9 months go by. Then in January of 1934, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. This piece of legislation accomplished two critical things. The government now owned it all. Second, it gave the president the authority to revalue gold by proclamation. Roosevelt wasted no time. He immediately announced that the new official price of gold was $35 per ounce. Let's look at the cold, hard math of this maneuver. The Treasury now held approximately 195 million ounces of gold. At the old price of $20.67, this hoard was worth about $4 billion. But at the new price of $35, the exact same pile of gold was suddenly worth $6.8 billion. The government had literally created $2.8 billion of value out of thin air simply by changing a number. In 1934, $2.8 billion was a monumental sum. The entire federal budget for that year was $6.5 billion. They had conjured up an amount equal to 43% of the entire federal budget, though the truly devastating effect was on the national debt. By devaluing the dollar against gold, they devalued the debt itself. Before it took $20.67 to buy an ounce of gold. Now it took $35. The dollar had instantly lost 40% of its value relative to gold. And since all government debts were denominated in those newly cheapened dollars, the real value of that debt burden fell by 40%. The government had effectively defaulted on 40% of its obligations without ever missing a payment. And the American citizens, who had dutifully turned in their gold, they were annihilated. They had received $20.67 per ounce. Now, gold was worth $35, but they were legally forbidden from buying it back. Executive Order 6102 made private ownership of gold illegal for Americans, and it remained illegal until 1974. For 41 years, citizens were forced to hold depreciating paper dollars, while their government sat on the largest stockpile of gold in the world. Those who had trusted their government lost 40% of their wealth instantly. The crushing inflation that followed the devaluation eroded their savings even further. By 1940, the real purchasing power of a citizen who had held gold and turned it in was down by 60% or more. This was not some unfortunate side effect. This was the plan from the beginning: confiscate the asset, revalue it, devalue the currency, erase the debt, and transfer wealth from the people to the state. It worked flawlessly, and it is about to happen again. Now, let me show you precisely why this playbook is being dusted off, and why 2025 is the pivotal year. The United States government is currently suffocating under a mountain of debt totaling $37 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio stands at an alarming 132%. Remember, in 1933 it was only 40% when the government resorted to confiscation. Today, the situation is more than 3 times worse. The annual interest payment alone on this colossal debt is $1.2 trillion. That is more than the entire defense budget. It is more than Medicare. And with interest rates still elevated at 5%, if they remain at this level, the interest payments will skyrocket to $1.8 trillion by 2027. The government cannot escape this debt trap through conventional means. It is mathematically impossible. You cannot tax your way out of a 132% debt-to-GDP ratio. The entire gross domestic product of the United States is $28 trillion. Even if you confiscated 100% of every dollar earned in the entire country, you still couldn't pay off the debt. You cannot grow your way out of it because the debt is expanding faster than the economies. There's only one path left, the same path Roosevelt took in 1933, confiscation and revaluation. But this time, they are not just coming for gold. They are coming for everything outside their control. President Trump signed an executive order establishing a Strategic Reserve. Let me read you the key language, because it is a near-perfect mirror of Executive Order 6102. The order declares Pindang a strategic asset vital to national security. It grants the Treasury the authority to acquire and hold Pindang. It directs all federal agencies to develop policies for digital asset management. It positions this new reserve as essential to maintaining American financial leadership. Now let me read you the key language from Roosevelt's order in 1933. The order declared gold a strategic asset vital to national economic stability. It granted the Treasury the authority to acquire and hold gold. It directed Americans to deliver their gold to Federal Reserve banks. It positioned the confiscation as essential to American financial recovery. The parallel is unmistakable. Strategic asset, Treasury authority to acquire. This is not a coincidence. This is the same playbook, meticulously updated for the digital age. Here's how the modern confiscation will unfold. Phase 1 is the legal framework. This is what the hypothetical executive order accomplishes. It establishes the legal authority for the Treasury to acquire and hold Pindang. It creates the government infrastructure for a strategic reserve. Most critically, it sets the precedent that Pindang is an asset of national security. Once an asset is designated as being critical to national security, the government can invoke emergency powers and wartime authorities to do almost anything it wants to acquire it. All the normal legal barriers to confiscation simply melt away. This phase is now complete. Phase 2 is voluntary acquisition. The government begins to accumulate Python, but not by buying it on the open market. That would cause the price to spike and would be far too expensive. Instead, they acquire it through other quieter means. They see Python from criminal enterprises. They already hold over 200,000 Python from the Silk Road case and other seizures. They begin accepting Python as payment for taxes and federal fines. The Internal Revenue Service already treats Playbook as property for tax purposes, so accepting it as a form of payment is a very small and logical next step. They could even use government-owned energy infrastructure, like hydroelectric dams and nuclear power plants, to mine Python at a near-zero operational cost. During this phase, they also perfect their system of tracking. This is where the modern Playbook becomes infinitely more dangerous than the 1933 version. Back then, gold was a physical object. You could hide it under your floorboards or bury it in the backyard. Enforcement was difficult because the government had to rely on people voluntarily admitting what they owned. But Python exists on a public transparent Playbook. Every transaction is recorded forever, and more importantly, every single American who has ever bought Python through a regulated exchange is now in a government database. Confiscation has your information, Kraken has your information. Every centralized exchange that required you to complete the Know Your Customer verification process. The government knows exactly who owns Python, how much they own, and when they bought it. They do not have to go door to door searching for hidden coins. They have a database. They can simply send you a letter that says, "Our records indicate you own 4.7 Python. You have 30 days to sell it to the U.S. Treasury at the official designated price. Failure to comply will result in criminal prosecution." Phase 3 is mandatory acquisition. This is the confiscation. Event: the government announces that due to a national security emergency and the need to ensure financial stability, all Python holdings above a certain threshold must be sold to the Treasury. Perhaps the threshold will be 1 Python, perhaps 10. But for anyone holding more than that amount, selling becomes mandatory. The price they offer will not be the market price. It will be an official price set by them. Maybe it is $50,000 per pint or $80,000, but it will be significantly below the prevailing market value. You will be forced to sell at a loss, just as Americans in 1933 were forced to sell their gold at $20.67. And just like in 1933, the penalties for non-compliance will be draconian: criminal charges, asset forfeiture, and prison time. Faced with these threats and the knowledge that their holdings are already documented in a government database, the vast majority of people will comply. You cannot hide what they already know you possess. Phase 4 is revaluation. After the government has acquired its target amount of Python, perhaps 1 million Python as has been suggested in proposed legislation, they execute the final move. They announce that for the purposes of valuing the assets on the U.S. government's balance sheet, Python will henceforth be valued at $1 million per coin, or $500,000, or whatever number is required to make their debt problem disappear. At $1 million per coin, a stash of 1 million Python suddenly becomes $1 trillion in assets. When combined with a similar revaluation of the nation's gold reserves, the government can instantly add $5 to $7 trillion in assets to its balance sheet. Assets that can be used to technically offset its crushing debt. But here is what happens to everyone else at the same time. Once the world's largest economy and military power officially declares that Python is worth $1 million, the global market will follow. The price will explode, first to $300,000, then $500,000, then $800,000. But as Python soars to $1 million, the US dollar collapses. A move from $100,000 to $1 million for a single Python represents a 90% loss in the dollar's value relative to that asset, and the 90% loss in purchasing power will bleed into everything else. The price of food, energy, and housing will hyperinflate. But the government's debt, which is denominated in those same worthless dollars, suddenly becomes manageable. You are about to be robbed legally and systematically, just like your ancestors were in 1933. But this time it is worse, because they have digital tracking. They have the database. They know exactly what you own. This is not a distant threat looming in 20 years. This is happening now. Let me lay out the timeline. 2025 is the accumulation phase. The government is quietly acquiring Python through seizures, mining, and other strategic acquisitions that do not appear in public market data. Simultaneously, they are perfecting the tracking infrastructure. The IRS is enforcing stricter reporting requirements on all exchanges. The Treasury is developing regulations for digital asset custody. They are methodically preparing the system for mass confiscation. 2026 is the crisis phase. The political fight over the debt ceiling becomes severe. The government faces a potential default on its obligations. The bond market begins to show signs of extreme stress. Yields spike as global investors dump holding U.S. government debt. This manufactured or real crisis creates the political justification for the government to take extraordinary measures. In times of crisis, the public will accept actions that would be politically impossible in normal times. Think of the Patriot Act passed after 9/11, or the massive bank bailouts after the 2008 crash. The next crisis will be the justification for confiscation. 2027 is the year of confiscation and revaluation. The government announces the mandatory sale of Python above the established threshold. They offer an official price that is well below the market price. Most people comply because their holdings are already in a government database, and the penalties for refusal are life-altering. After the acquisition is complete, they revalue Python to $1 million and gold to $20,000 an ounce. The dollar collapses, inflation explodes, and the government's real debt burden is erased. You lose. 2028 is the new normal. The great monetary reset is complete. Prices have stabilized at new, much higher levels. Those who held Python or gold that was confiscated have lost most of their wealth due to the gap between the official price they received and the new revalued price. Those who held only dollars have lost everything to hyperinflation. The middle class is wiped out, the government and those connected to it. This is not wild speculation, it is the logical outcome of a mathematical certainty. The debt cannot be paid, therefore it will be defaulted on through currency devaluation. Confiscation and revaluation is the only tool they have left, and the legal framework for it is already being put into place. There are ways to protect yourself from this impending financial cataclysm, but you have to act now, before the confiscation order is issued, before the database queries are run, before the mandatory sale letters are mailed. First, you must understand what they can and cannot easily confiscate. They can easily confiscate Bydum and other titles held on centralized exchanges. If your assets are on Contour, Kraken, Binance, US, Gemini, or any exchange that required identity verification, they know you have it. They can force the exchange to freeze your account or sell your assets directly to the Treasury. They can easily confiscate Bydum held in exchange traded funds, or ETFs. The popular Bygone ETFs from firms like BlackRock hold the underlying Python on behalf of investors. The government can simply order them to seize that underlying Python and pay out the investors in devalued dollars at the official lower price. If you hold a Python ETF, you are holding a prime confiscation target. What they cannot easily confiscate is self-custody crypto held in cold storage. If your Bydum is on a hardware wallet, like a ledger or a Trezor, for which you and only you control the private keys, and especially if you acquired it peer-to-peer or through non-KYC methods, they do not have a definitive record that you possess it. They cannot send you a confiscation letter for assets they do not know exist. This is the digital equivalent of burying gold in your backyard in 1933. The problem, of course, is that most people bought their crypto through regulated exchanges. The government already knows, so what do you do first? Withdraw everything from centralized exchanges. Immediately move your Python and other crypto to a self-custody hardware wallet where you control the keys. Yes, the exchanges have your purchase history, but if you move the assets to self-custody and the government later demands you sell all your holdings, you can plausibly claim you lost it. You forgot the password. The hardware wallet was damaged or destroyed. Proving you still possess it is far more difficult for them than proving you once bought it. This is not legal advice. It is a survival strategy. Second, consider non-KYC acquisition for any new purchases. There are ways to acquire Python without tying your identity to the transaction, such as peer-to-peer platforms, certain Python ATMs with low transaction, or even mining it yourself. These methods do not create the database entries that centralized exchanges do. Third, diversify jurisdiction. The United States is the epicenter of the coming confiscation, but other countries may not follow suit. Consider holding a portion of your assets through legal entities established in jurisdictions with strong property rights and no history of asset confiscation, such as Singapore, Switzerland, or certain Caribbean. Fourth, physical gold and private storage. Gold may also be targeted for revaluation, though probably not an outright confiscation like in 1933, simply because far fewer people own it today. But if you do own physical gold, store it privately. Do not keep it in a bank safe deposit box. Banks can be ordered by the government to freeze access to boxes and inventory their contents. Use a private vault storage facility or a high-quality safe in your home. Fifth, understand the penalty versus probability calculation. In 1933, most Americans complied with the gold confiscation order, but some did not comply. They hid their gold, they buried it. They lied about it, and they successfully preserved their wealth while their compliant neighbors lost 40%. The penalties were 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, but in reality, prosecutions were extremely rare. The government lacked the resources to hunt down and prosecute every single person who might be hiding a few gold coins. They relied on fear and voluntary confiscation. They will threaten severe penalties, but the practical reality of prosecuting millions of individual citizens for not selling their Bydum is unworkable. They need most people to comply willingly. This means that if you do not comply, and they do not have definitive proof, you still own the asset because it is in self-custody and you claim it is lost. Prosecution becomes highly unlikely. I'm not telling you to break the law, I'm telling you to understand the practical reality of how these laws are enforced. Sixth, real assets. the ultimate protection against currency. Devaluation is ownership of real tangible assets, productive land, income-generating real estate, profitable businesses that generate cash flow and essential commodities. These assets tend to rise in price as the dollar falls. They cannot be confiscated with a database query, and they produce real value regardless of what happens to the currency. If your portfolio is heavily weighted in financial assets like stocks, bonds, and cash, you are dangerously exposed to the coming devaluation. Real assets are the ultimate hedge. Now, let me address the objections, because I know what some of you are thinking. First, they will not confiscate Baidu because it would destroy innovation, and America would fall behind China in the digital asset race. This assumes the government prioritizes innovation over its own survival. It does not. When the choice is between losing global reserve currency status and confiscating crypto, they will confiscate. When the choice is between defaulting on $37 trillion in debt and devaluing the currency through confiscation, they will confiscate. Governments always choose their own survival above all else. Second, Baidu is different from gold because it is decentralized and cannot be controlled. The IRS has your information. The Playbook itself is a public ledger. They can see every transaction. The fact that Baidu's protocol is decentralized is irrelevant when the government knows exactly who owns it and can threaten those owners with prison. Decentralization protects the network. It does not protect you from a government that knows who you are. Third, there would be massive political backlash, and they would never get away with it. There was massive backlash against gold confiscation in 1933. It happened anyway. There was backlash against the bank bailouts in 2008. They happened anyway. When governments face an existential crisis, they do what they deem necessary. By the time the backlash materializes, your assets are already gone. This is not just about Baidu or gold. This is about the end of the current global monetary system. The US dollar's reign as the world's reserve currency is dying. The debt is unpayable. The system is unsustainable. Everyone in a position of power knows this. Central banks around the world know it, which is why they are buying gold at record rates. Foreign governments know it, which is why they are developing alternatives, like the BRICS currency, and the US government knows it, which is why they are positioning to confiscate hard assets before the final collapse. The people who turned in their gold in 1933 and held dollars were financially destroyed. The people who hid their gold, moved assets offshore, and owned real property that appreciated with inflation survived and thrived. The same great sorting is about to happen again. There will be those who comply with the confiscation, who hold their wealth in dollars, who trust the government. They will lose 70 to 90% of their purchasing power. And there will be those who see what is coming, who position themselves in self-custodied assets, in physical gold, in real estate, and in international diversification. They will preserve their wealth and be in a position to buy assets at depression-level prices when everyone else is bankrupt. The executive order establishing the Strategic Peacetime Reserve is the modern equivalent of Executive Order 6102. The language is the same, the mechanism is the same, the outcome will be the same. The only question is which side of this historic wealth transfer you will be on. The legal framework is in place. The database of owners exists. The timeline is 2025 to 2027. You have months, maybe a year, but not more. Once the confiscation order comes, it is too late. Your assets will be frozen. Your choices will be gone. You will either comply or face prison. Act now while you still can. If you found this analysis to be sure to subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.